Welcome to Biology of Marine Mammals. I'm Dr. Leslie Williams, and this lecture covers the adaptations for diving. So in the previous two lectures, we covered the fundamentals of respiration, where we learned about the concept of apnea. We're going to revisit that concept and look at some goals that need to be attained in order to achieve apnea. And then we'll actually look at some of the adaptations that marine mammals, especially the cetaceans, have adopted that help enhance tidal volume, and then some of the adaptations that may not necessarily be productive, but are necessary in order to achieve apnea, which is prolonged breath holding while diving. So let's get started. Recall that apnea is basically the ability to hold your breath. We can do apnea. We can hold our breath for 30 seconds, a minute. Some of us can even hold our breath for longer than a minute. Marine mammals, some of them, can hold their breath for over an hour, all while exerting physical activity such as diving. So being able to have this prolonged apnea is really the result of numerous anatomical, physiological, and even behavioral adaptations. So as we start to explore apnea and its connection with diving, we need to remember some of the goals. When you are going to get ready to have a prolonged period of breath holding, you first want to basically load up as much oxygen as possible in the blood. So you want to cram as much oxygen as you can into that blood. And then your other goal is to use as little oxygen as possible during the dive so that you can conserve it. So with this in mind, we're going to first take a look at goal number 1. How could we possibly load up as much oxygen in the blood as possible? Well, in order to first look at this, let's go back and review the idea of tidal volume. Take a breath. Go ahead, sit down, take a breath. The amount of air that you just exchanged is called tidal volume, and it's another way of saying a breath at rest. For humans, this amounts to about ½ liter per breath, or in other words, about 10 to 15% of the total air that's in your lungs at any given time. In other words, we're not very efficient breathers. Humans and most terrestrial animals are not very efficient breathers. There's some reasons for that, but mostly it's because we're around oxygen all the time, so we just take more breaths in order to exchange adequate amounts of air. So the idea is this, though. If you were a marine mammal and you want to have prolonged diving, then your goal is going to be to exchange as much air in one breath as possible, because the more air that you exchange, the more oxygen you're going to bring into your alveoli. And the more oxygen you bring in, the more you're going to load into your blood. So let's take a look at that concept first. In a previous lecture, we went over the idea that gas follows the law of diffusion. So if you have two compartments, an alveolus in your blood, then oxygen is going to move from the compartment that's more concentrated to the compartment that's less concentrated, as we see here, until there is equilibrium. So by constantly ventilating or replenishing the air in your alveoli through breathing, you get to continually add oxygen to your blood, where of course then it goes to your body to make energy so that you can continue your life function. But this picture might represent what we would consider to be a low tidal volume, something like humans, where in one breath you're only adding a few oxygen molecules into the bloodstream. Let's change this and look at high tidal volume. What would happen if we were able to bring in a lot more air or exchange a lot more air in one breath, such like we hope marine mammals are able to do? Well, suddenly the concentration gradient is much more drastic, and as a result, once equilibrium is reached, much more oxygen actually makes it into the blood. So this achieves our goal of loading up oxygen in the blood. So you can see here, a big goal is going to be to try to increase the tidal volume. So can marine mammals do it? Well, they certainly do. While humans only exchange between 10 and 15% of their lung volume with a normal breath, cetaceans, which of course include whales and dolphins, can exchange up to 75% of their airspace in one breath. That's an enormous amount. So they actually have a much, much, much greater tidal volume than humans do. And we can see that here with this blue whale spout. In fact, the spout is because the expiration is so forceful, because they have to exchange so much air in one breath, that they actually have this huge condensation of fluid that then sprays out as they exhale. A lot of people think the spout that they see is actually the whale or dolphin clearing water from their system, similar to the way you might clear a snorkel that gets filled up with water. You basically just blow it out. And that's not true. That's not water that's in their system. It's not water that leaked into their lungs. That's a result of basically having a very, very, very forceful expiration, something that's needed in order to exchange a huge amount of volume in one breath. So let's go ahead and take a look at anatomical adaptations that help with this great tidal volume for cetaceans. I've actually outlined 5 of them, so we'll cover the first 2 here. So one of the things you might have already noticed about the body plan is that the nares or nostrils are positioned in a different place than they are for humans and most terrestrial animals. So think of yourself swimming. Pretend for a moment that you're swimming, maybe breaststroke. And as you swim, you have to continually pull your head up out of the water in order to take a breath. Wouldn't it be so much easier if you were swimming and you simply had nostrils on the back of your head, and that you could just breathe with your head face down in the water as much as you want? Well, that's exactly what cetaceans have done. They have positioned their nares dorsally. Dorsally means along the back, so that they can have easy ventilation without having to lift their head out of the water every time they come up for air. And in this skeleton, this dolphin skull that we have right in front of us, we can actually see some evidence of that right there. And it's part of what's responsible for what's called the telescoping of the skull. So you can see the nares, which used to probably be closer to the tip of the jaw, have actually moved up here and are now at the top of the head. Even the pinnipeds and the sirenians have nares that are a little bit more superior or higher up than the normal terrestrial mammal. A second anatomical adaptation that also has to do with the nostrils are going to be these shields, these nostril shields that show up in the cetaceans. And you can see this here. When you get ready to come up and you surface to breathe, you're only exposing essentially your nostrils to the air. And if you're swimming in a bunch of water, waves and other turbulence could just wash water right into your nose. So it's similar to, of course, getting water into your snorkel during a big wave if you happen to be snorkeling. So what they've done is they've actually created these muscular shields that basically prop up and kind of create a shield that protects the nose underneath. And you can see that in the top picture here, the top right picture, and then the bottom 2 pictures, that anatomical shield that helps protect the nares from water getting in. So let's take a look at some of the other adaptations that also enhance tidal volume. And the other 3 adaptations that we're going to look at have to do with the lungs. So what I want to do is remind you, in a previous lecture, we learned that the ribs of a lot of these aquatic marine mammals are collapsible or compressible, which we see in this picture here. Why is that important? It's important because when you breathe, you require that your rib cage expand and collapse. The more plasticity you have in your rib cage going up and down and in and out, the more air you're going to be able to move. Part of the reason why humans can only exchange a small amount of air in any one breath is because our rib cage doesn't move very much. If we could take our rib cage and truly collapse it down, really push it in, we would be able to exhale a lot more air and therefore inhale a lot more air and have a much greater tidal volume. We don't have flexible ribs like they do. So because they have those collapsible ribs, they're able to basically move a lot more air volume than we are. Some of the other things also happen to do with moving air and part of the thoracic cage. Now, it turns out that when we ventilate, the ventilation is a combination of muscles that surround the lungs here, but also your diaphragm. And your diaphragm is found on humans on the underside of your lungs, just above your stomach. So our diaphragm tends to come forward at the bottom of the lungs. So when we breathe out, that diaphragm pushes up to allow us to exhale the air, and then pushes down to allow us to inhale the air. In marine mammals, their diaphragm is not positioned on the underside of their lungs. Their diaphragm is actually positioned more obliquely so that it covers more of the surface of the lungs. So instead of just trying to push and pull way down here, they're able to push and pull more at the surface, and because they have a lot greater muscular contact with those lungs, they can really squeeze those lungs and push out all the air, and then expand those lungs and draw in that air. So the positioning of their diaphragm is an anatomical adaptation that helps them move large volumes of air in one breath. And finally, the lungs are not necessarily positioned in the center of their rib cage as they are with humans. In fact, our lungs are positioned somewhat anteriorly or ventrally, more towards the surface. The lungs for a marine mammal tend to be positioned more towards the back. And not only that, the airways tend to be more reinforced so that they are open and a little bit wider than terrestrial counterparts. So what does this achieve? All of this lowers the resistance to breathing, making breathing a lot more easy. Anybody who is an asthmatic knows that breathing is not easy when there's a lot of resistance in the airways, such as when your bronchioles constrict. That we see that with asthma. That's basically a hallmark of the disease. So what they've done is they've said, you know what, let's move those lungs farther back, closer to the nostrils, so that we have less space to travel, and then we'll keep those airways nice and open and wide so that air can move freely without a lot of resistance. So those are 3 more anatomical adaptations that allow cetaceans to achieve this huge tidal volume. Okay, so now that we've taken a look at some of the adaptations for tidal volume, let's turn our attention to diving. So adaptations for diving. What we need to talk about at this point is the idea that with diving, there comes a risk. Whenever you pull air way down there, you risk getting what's called the bends. The bends are something even scuba divers fear and have to take great measures to avoid. All mammals are subject to the bends. So, because of that risk, there's actually a couple adaptations that seem counterintuitive to trying to load up as much oxygen as possible, but are necessary for preventing death from getting the bends. And one of them is smaller lungs than what would be predicted for size. As a rule, the larger you are, the bigger the lungs you have. But for marine mammals, we see that for their size, they tend to have smaller lungs. And this basically allows them to carry less oxygen down into the water as they dive, therefore less chance of getting the bends. The only exception to this are the sea otters. The sea otters have big lungs because they like to float and it's buoyant for them, but they're the exception and they're not deep divers, so it's not really a concern. Along with that, marine mammals tend to exhale before diving so that they get rid of some of the excess air, so they bring less air down to those deep depths. And some of the final adaptations for diving are both anatomical and behavioral. So along with being able to lower the amount of air that you bring down there, you got to make sure that you don't bring water in either. So there's actually these anatomical nasal plugs that kind of move out at the surface, but then as soon as they start diving, they get sucked back in. And they're essentially these little balls that basically plug the nose. So you could kind of think of basically having a nose plug shoved up your nose, and it would be the same idea. So these little balls that basically pop right in and plug up the nares so that no water leaks in. And finally, the way they breathe at the surface is very characteristic. They almost do something that might be considered similar to hyperventilating, where they take a series of shallow dives and basically a series of breaths, trying to basically exchange as much oxygen as possible, load as much oxygen into the blood as possible, and then taking one big breath and doing a deep dive. So having those series of shallow dives is necessary with those frequent surfacing to exchange as much oxygen as possible, bring as much oxygen in, and then let all the excess air out and go down deep. And so with that, I will see you next time.